Well, hello everyone and welcome aboard. It's Rob from PMDG back with another DC-6 for Microsoft Flight Simulator tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about energy management, and specifically we're going to be talking about how to use drag to appropriately manage the energy of the airplane as you're approaching the runway. This is one of those things that all you jet pilots are going to want to pay attention to. It'll actually help you with your jet flying. But for now, let's get started. Okay, so here we are flying above the German countryside. You'll notice I've got the flaps hanging out to 20 degrees, and I've done that on purpose because I want to make a point. And you've heard me say this in other tutorial videos, but radial engines do not like when you move the throttles. If a radial engine could have it its way, you would have one power setting for the entire flight, and that's all you would ever use. The engineers who designed the airplane also were heavily involved in the design of the engines, and so they designed the airplane in such a way as to minimize the number of times that you might need to move the throttles while flying the airplane. To simplify that a little bit, you've got a takeoff power setting, you've got a climb power setting, you've got a cruise power setting. You'll use the cruise power setting through most of the descent, as we've already seen. Then you've got an intermediate power setting you'll use to slow down. Then you have an approach power setting. And once you set that power, you should be able to leave it exactly where it is all the way down to the runway as you pull the power out in the flare. In jets, we can move the throttles around all we want. The jet doesn't care. Radial engines really don't like that. Acceleration and deceleration of RPM is really hard on radial engines. So, you want to fly this like a pro? I'm going to show you how. Let's talk about how this works. Alright, we're going to the whiteboard. We got our runway here, we got our airplane over here. Again, I'm a pilot, not an artist, no making fun. Okay, so we have a theoretical glide path to a runway, and it's going to be about 3 degrees, maybe a little bit plus, a little minus. Now, I don't care if you have the ILS up and your hand flying it, or you've got the airplane on the gyropilot linked to the ILS, or you're eyeballing this and doing it by hand. There is one simple formula that will help you determine whether your energy solution is working in terms of reaching that runway. And when I talk about energy solution, I'm talking about being high or being low relative to the glide path to the runway. Here's how the math works. For our theoretical glide path to the runway, we expect to cover 300 feet of altitude per nautical mile as we descend. In other words, if we're 10 nautical miles from that runway, we should be 3,000 feet AGL. Now, I'm going to put a pink box around this and draw an arrow to it because this above ground level is extremely important. We are going to be landing in Paderborn, Germany, and the runway there is about 700 feet mean sea level. So when we're doing this math in our head, don't forget to add in the 700 feet. So if we're 10 nautical miles from the runway, we need to be at 3,700 feet. Let's do another example just to show you how easy this is. We're 16 nautical miles from the runway, 300 feet, so we got to be 4,800 feet AGL plus our runway altitude, 700 feet, so 5,500 feet. So it's pretty simple. If I'm 16 nautical miles out, I want to see 5,500 feet. If I see above it or I see below it, that's where I am relative to the approach path, and I'll show you how that works in just a minute. It really is quite easy. So let's go through, and here's our theoretical glide path again. We are going to be shooting this approach into Paderborn. We're going to do it with no electronic guidance, with nothing backing it up. We are just going to look at our distance from the airport and figure out our altitude. Now, we've talked about this before, but a quick review. In level flight, as we approach the glide path where we want to start down, we want to be about flaps 20 or flaps 30, and that will slow us to about 140 knots. That will give us the optimal speed at which we want to intercept the glide path and start down. And the power setting we want to use is 100 BMEP. We're going to set that power and then we're not going to touch the throttles again until we land. Now we're going to do that. Step 1 is flaps 20 or flaps 30. Step 2 is going to be when we intercept the glide path, we're going to go gear down and flaps 30. And we're going to do that right here at the point where we start down to start going to that runway. If we go to gear down and flaps 30, the airplane is just naturally going to have enough drag that it's going to start downhill. And it's going to do that because the airplane is static stability and all this other stuff that we can go into in another day if you're really interested. All right. Step 3, when we still want to start slowing down as we're coming down the glide path, we're going to go to flaps 40, and that'll slow us to about 120 knots. And then we're going to go to flaps 50, and that should slow us down to somewhere 100 to 110 knots. So we'll do that right before we get to the runway, probably to around 200 feet. So these are the settings we're going to use, and if we use them correctly, we can leave 100 BMEP set, and we're going to reach the glide slope intercept point, and we're going to start down at gear down flaps 30. Then we're going to go to flaps 40. The airplane will slow down a little bit. Then we're going to go to flaps 50. That'll take us all the way to the runway. We can wipe the power out right as we cross the threshold. But now here's the little secret. It's never going to work out perfectly. Chances are we're going to wind up a little bit high above the glide path. We'll be at flaps 40 and just sort of paralleling it. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add drag, and that drag is going to then lead us back down toward the glide path, maybe even a little bit below. So I'm going to show you how to use the drag configuration of the airplane to sort of dial you right into the appropriate glide path on the way down. Now there's a couple of ground rules here that I want to talk you through. We're going to leave the power alone, and you're only going to trim just a tiny little bit. And in a perfect world, if you could just nail it all right on at the glide path intercept point, you could be flaps 40, 100 BMEP, it'll take you all the way to the runway. And that's probably not going to happen. Here's what it's probably going to wind up looking like. You're going to wind up going a little bit high above the glide path, then you're going to go to flaps 40, and you're going to parallel it for a while. And then we'll add flaps 50, add some drag, that'll take us back toward the glide path. Then we'll go back to flaps 40, and because we're good pilots, zip all the way down to the runway and we're done. That's probably not going to happen either. We're probably going to wind up descending through the glide path. Then we'll go to flaps 30, we'll go back above the glide path slightly, we'll go to flaps 50, we'll go back down below the glide path, flaps 30, flaps 50, back and forth. Eventually we'll figure it out. We'll go to flaps 40 all the way to the runway, flaps 50, slow down, wipe the power out, and we're done. See? Easy. All right, you're on your own. Okay, all right, no, you're not on your own yet. Let me simplify this for you a little bit. You got 3 settings you got to worry about. If you've paid attention this long, by the way, this is the secret right here. If you are on speed and on the glide path, be at flaps 40. If you find yourself a little bit fast and going a little bit high on the glide path, go to flaps 50. If you find yourself below the glide path and maybe starting get a little bit slow, go to flaps 30. Doing that, you're not going to have to change the trim a whole lot. Basically, if you are on trim at flaps 40, going from flaps 40 to flaps 50 to flaps 30 to flaps 50 to flaps 30 back to 40, you really shouldn't need to change the trim at all. And because the airplane is statically stable, the airplane's going to want to adjust itself to recapture the glide path for you. Now, all of this is going to be done at 100 BMEP. You're not going to touch the power. Instead of using power like you would in a jet, you're going to use flaps. That's how we do it in radial engine airplanes. Okay. You ready to see it in action? Are you confused yet? Watch how I do it. I think it'll make a lot more sense after you see it in action. Here we go. So we are currently configured at flaps 30, 100 BMEP, level at 4,000 feet. The gyro pilot is flying the airplane. We're about 16 miles or so from the Paderborn airport. We've already slowed the airplane up to our airport environment approach speed. We're doing just under 140 knots, and the airplane's still slowing a little bit. It should stabilize at about 130 knots. what's going to happen next is we're going to reach the point where we want to start the airplane descending. To do that, we're going to want to add more drag. The airplane is currently trimmed up nicely and flying level at 130 knots. So if we add drag, the airplane's going to tend to slow down a little bit. When it does, it's going to then nose over and start to descend. A little bit of trim from us in order to get it to about 600 or 700 foot per minute rate of descent, and it is going to fly that glide path all the way down for us. We're then going to switch to flaps 40, and then we'll bounce back and forth between flaps 30 and flaps 50 in order to go above or below the glide path depending on what we need to do. That's the whole point of the demonstration. So we're coming up on, I think, about 14 miles here. Yeah, there we are. So we'll go ahead and take the airplane off the gyropilot in order to start preparing for the descent. And I'm not using an ILS. I'm doing this purely through mental math just to demonstrate to you how easy it is and how well the drag configuration process works. Again, jet pilots tend to do a lot of throttle movements. Radial engine pilots don't like to do throttle movements at all. So what we're going to do is leave the 100 BMEP set. I might have to adjust the throttles a little bit as we descend because we're going into denser air, so the manifold pressure will tend to increase as we descend. But I'm just going to try to keep it right at 100 BMEP, and that's it. There's not going to be much throttle movement at all. I might have to do a little bit of trimming as we make flap changes, but we're going to be using flaps primarily to add drag to the airplane in order to get us above, below, or on the glide path. So here comes our gear. The airplane's trimmed up nicely for 130 knots. We just added a whole bunch of drag. Now you'll notice on the vertical speed indicator right there that the airspeed's coming down, and the vertical speed indicator is also now starting to show a descent, and the airplane just kind of naturally falls into about a 500-600 foot per minute rate of descent, which is just about perfect. So as we start downhill, you'll notice I've got 100 BMEP set. Airspeed's kind of fallen off to about 125 knots, which is great. Checking our distance, doing a little mental math, we're about 10 miles from the airport. 10 times 300, 3,000 feet, plus the 700 feet, because we know the runway's at 700 feet. We should be at about 3,700 feet, and look, there we are. Things are going great. You can do this distance check over and over again, or you can just get in the habit of checking maybe every 20 seconds or so and doing that little math computation in your head. And that will give you a really good idea. Are you on the glide path? Are you trending above the glide path? Are you trending below the glide path? It really becomes second nature, and it's actually kind of fun. It really will help you fly a visual approach to a runway much more effectively, and it reduces your reliance on an ILS or some type of a GPS aid in order to get to a runway, and it just makes you a pro. So it's a whole lot more fun to do it this way. So again, distance from the runway times 300 plus whatever the elevation of our runway is, that tells you what altitude you should be at right now. We're coming up on 7 miles, 7 times 300, 2,100, plus 700, we should be about 2,800 feet, and look at that. We are absolutely right on. Now, if you had a tailwind, you might find yourself trending high. How would you correct it? You'd add drag. So let's just, for example, right now I just selected flaps 40. We've added a whole bunch more drag. Now I'm not adjusting the power. We're leaving the power where it is. You'll notice it's been creeping up a tiny little bit. I'm going to move it back now just to keep us at 100 BMEP. But the airplane is naturally pitching down and increasing our rate of descent because it's trimmed to fly at about 120 knots. When it does that, we're going to start descending more rapidly. We're going to go below the glide path. So if I want to stop that, I can add a little bit of trim, which I'm doing now, to keep the descent rate between 600 and 700 feet per minute. And instead, the airplane will just slow down a little bit. So we really can modulate it the way we want to. Now, if we do start to get below the glide path, you'll see I'm just kind of pointing out that I'm keeping it at 100 BMEP, but you'll see that if we start to get below our desired glide path, so right now we're 5 miles from the runway, so we should be 1,500 feet plus 700 is 2,200, so we're a little bit low now. Now a jet pilot would add power here, not us. We can reduce drag by bringing the flaps back up to flaps 30. That will sort of naturally cause the airplane to trend upward. Now, what I want to demonstrate for you, I just set flaps 50 because I want to start slowing us down. And I'm trimming the airplane in order to keep the descent rate from increasing. And when I do that, the airplane starts to slow down. You can see we're slowing now nicely to about 110 knots, which is really where we want to be crossing the fence. We're just a couple miles out. We're pretty much right on the glide path. No ILS, no GPS, glide path aids. We are using the GPS for distance. That's okay. But notice how calm things are. We're not jockeying the power around. We're not changing power settings. We're not trimming wildly. We just added a bunch of drag and a little bit of trim, left the power where it is, and we're letting the design of the airplane do the work for us. You can see we're at 105 knots, 100 BMEP. We've added a tiny little bit of trim. I've probably blipped the trim maybe 3 times since we put the gear down. If you're watching someone fly this airplane and there's a whole lot of throttle motions, either they're in really turbulent air or they're working much harder than they need to. We radial engine pilots, we like to keep things simple. So set the power, leave it there, use the drag configuration of the airplane to do the work for you. A little bit of trim, you can see the airplane's got a nice nose down attitude and a whole lot of flap hanging out. Now here we're crossing the runway threshold. You can see a nice level nose attitude. We're just going to hold that and slowly bring the power out. Let the airplane settle on. And that's it. We're down. We'll bring the reverse in. Come up about 30 inches of manifold pressure for reverse is a pretty good number. And that's it, folks. It really is that easy. Set 100 BMEP, put the gear down, start downhill, go to flaps 40. If you start to get high, go to flaps 50. If you start to get low, go to flaps 30. Really that simple. No need to jockey the power. Make your life easy. I think you've probably figured out by now I'm really all about keeping things easy. All right, I think that's enough for today. As always, thank you for flying PMDG. We do appreciate it very much. Fly safely, be well, look after one another. We'll see you real soon.